All right, so continuing on, Dewey had just been talking about rationality, how that applies as looking at the relations of means and ends, and he's been talking about axioms or first principles and how these are not things that are true or false per se, but are meaningful in terms of their consequences, in terms of how they guide inquiry. And he's going to expand a little bit on that or say a little bit more about that in the next paragraph. And of course, he'll say more about that in more detail in the rest of the book. So this next paragraph, the character of the generalization of the relation of first principles and conclusions in mathematical and physical science may be illustrated by the meaning of first principles in logic, such as traditionally represented by the principles, say, of identity, contradiction, and excluded middle. So some well-known logical principles. According to one view, he says, such principles represent ultimate invariant properties of the objects with which methods of inquiry are concerned, and to which inquiry must conform. So one traditional view or conventional view or maybe mainstream view of these principles, these first principles such as identity, contradiction, excluded middle, one view is that these are properties of the universe, properties to be found in the universe, then logic needs to conform to the universe, right? These properties, these ultimate invariant properties to be found in the universe. But going on, so according to the down here. So according to the view here expressed, so according to Dewey's view, the view that he's trying to express, these principles represent conditions which have been ascertained during the conduct of continued inquiry to be involved in its own successful pursuit. So the other view of logical principles, the one that Dewey is holding, is that principles are just those are just what has been shown to be successful in guiding inquiry, in the conduct of inquiry, in terms of pursuing successful inquiry. So the two statements, these two different positions, the two statements may seem to amount to the same thing. Theoretically, there is a radical difference between them. For the second position implies, as has already been stated, that the principles are generated in the very process of control of continued inquiry. Right? So the principles are generated in the very process of control of continued inquiry, while according to the other view, they are a priori principles fixed antecedently to inquiry, conditioning it ab extra. So we've talked about, I've mentioned this several times. Dewey has brought it up several times already, so probably don't need to go into too much explanation about that again, but contrasting the view that logical principles are something external to inquiry that you impose on inquiry versus the view that logical principles come out of inquiry and then feed back into the inquiry in terms of guiding it when they are shown to be successful. But let's go on. So neither the existence nor the indispensability of primary logical principles is then denied. So we're not denying that logical principles are important. The question concerns their origin and use. Right? The question concerns their origin and use. That's what the important thing is right now. It's not that we need logical principles. Dewey is concerned with where do they come from? How do we use them? In what is said upon this matter, I follow in the main the account given by Peirce of guiding or leading principles. So once again, he's mentioned Charles Sanders Peirce, who he has borrowed a lot from, been influenced a lot by. And according to this view, every inferential conclusion that is drawn involves a habit. either by way of expressing it or initiating it, in the organic sense of habit, since life is impossible without ways of action sufficiently general to be properly named habits. And this was one of Peirce's big terms, was habits, and this is a Peircean idea that organisms develop habits in order to live successfully. I mean, this is influenced, of course, by Darwin as well. And Dewey and Peirce and the other early pragmatists were responding to the kind of the new paradigm that was given in Darwin's work. So successful living involves habits. You know, we need habits just to be able to get around. And logic is one way to look at logic is an expression of habits that successful habits that we have developed, and kind of a formalization of habit. So bottom of the page here, at the outset, the habit that operates in an inference is purely biological. It operates without our being aware of it. We are aware at most of particular acts and particular consequences. Later, we are aware not only of what is done from time to time, but of how it is done. So operating purely on habit, we might be aware of what gets done. As we reflect, we come to know about how it is done. So attention to the way of doing is, moreover, indispensable to control of what is done. The craftsman, for example, learns that if he operates in a certain way, the result will take care of itself, certain materials being given. In like fashion, we discover that if we draw our inferences in a certain way, we shall, other things being equal, get dependable conclusions. The idea of a method of inquiry arises as an articulate expression of the habit that is involved in a class of inferences. So habits, in a sense, are inference, right? We apply them to new situations as an inference. So you infer based on what you know, what seems to be certain, to new things, to things you know less about, things that are unknown. And habits work in the same way. We build them up over the past and then extend them to new situations. And as you pay attention to that. So attention to the way of doing is indispensable to control of what is done. So as we learn to pay attention to how this works, we gain control over it, right? If you start paying attention to your habits, that's one way of gaining control over your habits. So you're not just continuing on habits that are, less and less effective over time. You pay attention to whether these habits are still working and you modify them, you gain control of them. Right. And the other kind of point brought out here is that the way we do things affects the consequences. So how we do something matters. So again, paying attention to how we do it can improve how it gets done, right? Improve the consequences that we're going after, that we're trying to attain. Going on. Since, moreover, habits that operate are narrower and wider in scope, the formulations of methods that result from observing them have either restricted or extensive breadth. So habits can apply narrowly or more broadly. And so formulating methods based on those formulating principles, based on observing how habit works, can also be either more restricted, more limited, or apply more broadly. Peirce illustrates the narrower type of habit by the following case. A person has seen a rotating disc of copper come to rest when it is placed between magnets. He infers that another piece of copper will behave similarly under like conditions. At first, such inferences are made without formulation of a principle. Right? You don't necessarily need to explicitly state or have a particular, a special reason why you think another piece of copper will behave similarly. It's kind of a natural inference, habitual kind of inference. So at first, such inferences are made without formulation of a principle. The disposition that operates is limited in scope. Right? It just applies, or it does not extend beyond the pieces of copper. So it just applies in this limited situation. One piece of copper is likely going to be very much like another piece of copper. But, going on, but when it is found that there are habits involved in every inference, in spite of differences of subject matter, and when these habits are noted and formulated, then the formulations are guiding or leading principles. Yeah, so once we discover, once we learn, once we observe that habits are involved in making inferences, then you can start to formulate more universal guiding principles. The principles state habits operative in every inference that tend to yield conclusions that are stable and productive in further inquiries. Being free from connection with any particular subject matter, they are formal, not material, though they are forms of material that is subjected to authentic inquiry. This last sentence is a little tricky, right? But the basic idea is that observing how habits work in every case, not just in one limited case, you can draw more broadly applicable guiding principles that will yield successful results over time. And he talks about how these principles are free from connection with any particular subject matter. Therefore, they are formal, not material. Though he concludes they are forms of material that is subjected to authentic inquiry. There's different ways of reading this. I think the idea is that they are ways of forming material so that it can be successfully a subject of successful inquiry. So we use these forms to form the material that we're looking at so that we can successfully manipulate it, successfully measure it, successfully have it as the subject of inquiry. There's a strong relationship here with his aesthetic theory and with the how form and material or form and content work in aesthetics and pragmatist aesthetics. But that will take us a little bit too far afield. So going on, validity of the principles is determined by the coherency of the consequences produced by the habits they articulate. Yeah, so what ensures or what gives these principles their validity? That's the coherence of the consequences that result. If the habit in question is such as generally produces conclusions that are sustained and developed in further inquiry, then it is valid, even if in an occasional case it yields a conclusion that turns out invalid. In such cases, the trouble lies in the material dealt with, rather than with the habit and general principle. This distinction obviously corresponds to the ordinary distinction between form and matter, but it does not involve the complete separation between them that is often set up in logical theories. Let's go back to the beginning of that paragraph for a moment. Yeah, so if the habit in question from which a principle is drawn produces useful conclusions that can be sustained and developed, right? Maintained in further inquiry, then it's valid, even though sometimes it might produce a conclusion that turns out to be invalid. He says that the trouble lies in the material dealt with in this case. So there may be perhaps materials that are inappropriate, for example, to be dealt with by this principle. So we may need to be careful about that. And he mentions the distinction between form and matter, but that this is not a complete separation. So there's always this interplay between form and matter. The form comes out of our workings upon matter. So form is just more general. It applies to many different kinds of matter, but it's not separate from matter. It comes out of matter and then is applied back onto matter, or material, I should say. Well, he says matter here. Going on. Any habit is a way or manner of action. So this is kind of a typical pragmatist statement, very Peircean. Any habit is a way or manner of action, not a particular act or deed. When it is formulated, it becomes, as far as it is accepted, a rule, or more generally, a principle or law of action. So a successful habit, we could state that verbally, perhaps verbalize it as a principle or law of action. It can hardly be denied that there are habits of inference and that they may be formulated as rules or principles. If there are such habits as are necessary to conduct every successful inferential inquiry, then the formulations that express them, that will express those habits, will be logical principles of all inquiries. So if there are habits that come into any successful inference, any successful inferential inquiry, then if we verbalize those, make those into principles, they should be logical principles of all inquiries, right? So we have habits in for many different things, but there may be habits that are common across all successful inquiries. In this statement, going on, so in this statement, successful means operative in a manner that tends in the long run, or in continuity of inquiry, to yield results that are either confirmed in further inquiry or that are corrected by the use of the same procedures. So this is an interesting way to think about success, the success of principles in inquiry. They yield results that continue to be confirmed by our further inquiry, or they yield results that if they're not confirmed, that they can be corrected by using those same procedures, right? So it shows that maybe, we can make mistakes, we can get things wrong, we can maybe apply principles in the, more narrower principles on the wrong kind of materials. But eventually, if our principles are sound, if our leading or guiding principles are sound, these mistakes, these errors should get ironed out, should get corrected. And if they don't, then it shows that our principles are not successful, that maybe our guiding principles are not appropriate, are not valid. And continuing on, so these guiding logical principles are not premises of inference or argument. They are conditions to be satisfied, such that knowledge of them provides a principle of direction and of testing. This also is a little bit tricky. So premises, kind of a common logical term, but these guiding principles are not premises. So it's not, if this premise is true, then this conclusion is true. It's, if we take this principle as valid, then our conclusions should be valid. The conclusion of our inquiry should be valid. So knowledge of them provides a principle of direction and of testing. They are formulations of ways of treating subject matter that have been found to be so determinative of sound conclusions in the past that they are taken to regulate further inquiry until definite grounds are found for questioning them. Yeah, so again, they are conditions to form successful inquiry. They've been found successful in the past. We should continue using them unless they unless we develop definite grounds for questioning them if they end up misleading us in various circumstances. So while these guiding principles are derived from examination of methods previously used in their connection with the kind of conclusion they have produced, they are operationally a priori with respect to further inquiry. So there's a little bit of a play of a posteriori. Am I saying that right? A posteriori and a priori, where principles come out of our observation of successful habits, and then we use them, and then at that point they kind of become a priori because we use them, we plan to use them, we decide to use them to guide future inquiry. So they kind of flip into a priori principles, guiding principles, leading principles, right? At that point. So again, there's no absolute a priori for Dewey. Things come out of our just everyday inquiry from observing our habits, observing what works and doesn't work. And we formulate those, refine those into logical principles and use them then for further inquiry. So it's more this cycle, back and forth, feedback kind of loop rather than a quest for logical a priori, absolute a priori things that are separate, a priori principles that are, absolutely external, necessarily external to any given inquiry. Right, so just concluding this section here, Dewey says, in the previous discussion, I have made statements whose full force can become clear only in the more detailed development of logical themes in subsequent chapters. The discussion, as was said at the outset, is not intended to justify the position, but to clarify its general meaning. In the remaining pages of this introduction, I shall set forth certain implications of the position for the theory of logic. So again, just mentioning that this is all introductory and there's many more pages to go, so all of this will be more fleshed out. In the next section, he's gonna go through some, you can see one of them there, go through some different implications of his position, summarize some of what to expect. So I will take that up in the next video.